Back with another infographic show. This the one we got the evil punishments designed to be worse than death. Alright. Now, I ain't gonna lie. I fuck with these videos, but we can't be having these little goofy stuff going on to where we beefing about juice and saying, oh, since we want to go to war, you can't get no more juice with your bread. You know what I'm saying? No goofy shit like that. Other than that, I fuck with these videos, these bitches. You know what I'm saying? They gonna tell you a thing or two, let you know something. And I'm gonna let y'all know something while we let each other know something. No? Yeah? I don't know. Shit. Let me know in the comments what y'all want me to react to. Other than that, let's get straight to this shit.
Who crosses the line could find themselves facing the gallows or the headsman at any point throughout history, although crossing the line could mean anything from murder to just annoying the king. However, in many places, the death penalty isn't the worst thing that the courts have to offer. Here are 15 of the evil punishments worse than death administered throughout history. Number 15. Flaying.
Weed in my
Let's turn
mouth.
the clock back
Flaying? What that mean? Flying and playing at the same time?
to ancient Assyria, roughly 850 BCE. The ruler Ashur-nasir-pal II was known for his brutal treatment of captives and rebel leaders, but one method created a special dread for victims. Using a special set of knives, the torturers would slowly remove the unfortunate victim's skin, and this was something they practiced a lot. They not only knew how to remove the skin smoothly, but how to keep the victim alive for as long as possible. To ensure this, they'd start the cutting at the lower legs, thighs, and the buttocks, all areas without proximity to vital organs, making it more likely the victim would remain in agonizing pain for longer without bleeding out. This was a highly effective form of torture, and if the torturers wanted information, they were likely to get it quickly. A victim who gave their captives what they wanted could survive the beginning stages of flaying, but the risk of
That's
infection would be
crazy.
high. But for
That's
most, it was a
crazy.
prolonged and terrible execution. So how
No,
long
that's
could someone survive a flaying? The combination of blood loss, infections, shock from extreme pain, and hypothermia from exposure to the elements without the protection of your skin means most people could survive few days
at most.
at the most after being flayed. The skilled Assyrian torturers knew how to remove the skin smoothly, often keeping it in one piece for it to be displayed as a horrible flag of warning. They were clearly proud of their skill, and torture is immortalized in many of their art pieces from the era. And while the Assyrians eventually passed into history, the method became less common but did not die out. It was a common method of torturing religious heretics in empires for more than 1,000 years, and while using it on a human today would be frowned upon, it's still a common skill for hunters who want to keep an animal's pelt intact for use. But that's nothing compared to what the
Yeah, which is kind of crazy to me. Like, y'all, never mind.
Persians came
Another
up with.
video.
Number 14. The boats. Flaying usually kills people after a short period of intense torture, but other methods keep the pain going for a lot longer. When a soldier named Mithridates murdered the brother of the king wanted him to suffer. Sure, the king's brother had been attempting a coup, but it didn't matter. He ordered the soldier to be taken to the boats. This wasn't exile. It was something much worse. The condemned could be taken to a pair of boats, with one lying on top of the other. Holes would then be cut in the boat for the victim's head, hands, and feet. So he would be trapped inside. But then the real torture begins, and it starts with dessert. The condemned man is force-fed a mixture of milk and honey, pumping him full of the sweet mixture until he's nearly to the point of nausea, and left in the sun with the sticky substance drying all over his face and body. And from there, nature takes its course. The sweet mixture starts attracting insects, who land on the man's body and begin sucking it off of him, creating a constant feeling of irritation. Joining the flies will be bees and wasps, which will be painfully stinging him. And inside the boat, the man's bloated body will release excrement, which will attract worms and other vermin. Inside the darkened boat, they'll start.
Come on, bro. No, come on, man. Looking ass. What are you talking about?
Biting at his body and eventually burrowing in, leading him to die a slow, painful death from his body being consumed by vermin. This technique seems to have only been used in Persia, although it horrified the Greco-Roman historian Plutarch so much that he made a special mention of it in his biography of the sadist king who invented it. Was this just one madman's creation, or was this a common fate for criminals and traitors in Persia? The answer might be lost to history. It wasn't the only time animals were used to bring death. Number 13. Poena Coulée. Roman law was one of the most advanced systems of law the world had ever seen at the time, and that also meant the judges could get a little more creative. When a judge had a suspect in front of him who had been convicted of killing his father, he decided he deserved more than just a simple execution. And there would have been some surprising supporting characters in the mix. First, the convict would have been severely whipped, and his head would have been covered in a sack, at which point he would have been sewn up into a large leather sack. But he wouldn't
What the fuck?
be the only one in the sack. He would be joined by a collection of live animals.
What the we seen this in our last video.
None of them friendly. At which point the whole collection would be thrown into the water to drown, with the idea that the animals would savagely attack the unfortunate man in their panic as they all sank down to their watery deaths. No word on if the animals were convicted of anything. But what animals were chosen for this terrible ritual?
Exactly. What the animals do. They ain't get charged with nothing.
This varies, but one thing that seems consistent is that they were all capable of causing pain. One common choice was a rooster, whose beak and talons were capable of dealing out a lot of damage quickly. Also common was a venomous snake, who's more likely to bite when panicked. Not even a man's best friend was safe. A wild dog was a common addition.
They put a dog in that bitch? How'd a dog fit in that motherfucker?
Fourth varies, but several reports point to a monkey being included, which might seem like an odd choice unless you've been attacked by them and seen how quickly they bite and claw. One thing is for sure, this wasn't a role any of them were auditioning for. While this was mostly a Roman invention, it's reported that it was revived to a certain extent in medieval Germany. There, only a cat and a dog were used, and they fought like, well, you know. Unlike other forms of execution, this one wasn't about prolonging the torture.
Let me know in the comments why y'all think dogs are scared of cats. It don't make no sense.
Of the victim, it was simply about making those last few minutes before
Dog be
drowning
scared
as
of
horrible
cats.
as possible. But no Roman execution method was more infamous than this one. Number 12. Crucifixion. It's one of the most famous images in religious history, the Christian Messiah Jesus being nailed to a cross for angering the Roman authorities. But while it's mostly associated with religious martyrdom now, it was a common Roman execution method, so common that religious texts refer to thieves and other criminals sentenced for hanging alongside Jesus. And whether you were a rebel rabbi or a common thief, there were few worse ways to die. It served not just as a slow death.
Dumb ways to die. So many dumb. No, y'all know that shit. No.
But as a warning to others, the crosses were placed in a
Just made
public
me look
square,
stupid,
and the
man.
condemned were frequently jeered and tormented by onlookers as they died a slow death. But unlike many of the other methods in the list, crucifixion didn't deal a fatal injury. It just set them up to die from other factors like blood loss and asphyxiation. And the torture started early. The ritual would start with the condemned being forced to bear the heavy wooden cross on their back, often while being whipped.
Put
After
that
the
bitch
cross
through
was
the
placed, they would
hand.
be nailed to it, through their wrists, and hung from it. Sometimes the feet would be nailed as well, although evidence isn't consistent.
My
With their arms
veins.
splayed out to the side, they would be left to hang for anywhere from hours to days. Because their whole body weight was held by their arms, the typical cause of death would be trouble breathing due to the pressure on the lungs. However, elements like heart failure, dehydration, or infection from the wounds inflicted by the crucifixion and whippings can also spell the end of the convict. However long they lasted, it would be an agonizing end. But
God
because this
dang.
execution method isn't immediately fatal and due to its religious association, today a small group of zealots chose to have themselves temporarily crucified as a penance ritual. At least it's ancient history as a punishment, right? Not quite. It was used in places like Japan and Burma as late as the 1800s, with some isolated reports of it being used to
At that
torture
point,
prisoners
I
of
just
war
wanna
during
die. What the
World War
fuck?
II. It wasn't the only method that stood the test of time. Number 11. Immurement. Sometimes the most horrible thing to do to someone is to do nothing. One of the most ancient methods of torture was to take a convict and wall them in alive somewhere and then just walk away. Out of sight, out of mind for those dealing out the punishment. But for the condemned, they're left alone, in the dark, with nothing but their mind to keep them company as they slowly die a painful death due to either dehydration or asphyxiation, depending on how much air there is in the confined space. If the condemned is buried alive in a coffin, as has happened accidentally to people wrongly declared dead, they'll likely be dead within hours from a lack of air. But if they're kept in a larger space, it's likely to be fairly longer and more painful. While this was commonly used as a method of execution, it has also been used for human sacrifice. But one case was more famous than any other. The Vestal Virgins of Rome took a sacred oath to become priestesses dedicated to the goddess Vesta. They had two main duties: to maintain the sacred fire and to maintain a vow of chastity and celibacy. If they broke the latter, the punishment was dire. They would first be stripped of all their honors and ritually scourged. Their fellow virgins would dress them like a corpse,
They gonna break that shit with me around. Don't play.
a mock funeral for them, and carry them to a small underground vault. There they would be left in what looked like a small room, oddly containing a couch, lamp, and even some food. And an area where the vault was built would be filled up with dirt and buried. The horrible ritual was conducted around 10 times over the 1,000 years that the Vestal Virgins existed. This continued as a form of punishment for thousands of years, but how severe
Dang.
it was depended on the circumstances. The murderous Hungarian Countess Elizabeth Bathory was immured within her own castle, but she was supplied with food and lived for 4 years in her palace tomb. Now let's get into the Middle Ages, which were called the Dark Ages for a reason. Number 12, the breaking wheel. Europe loved its public executions, with everyone from murderers to heretics to common thieves facing their turn at some point. But for those deemed truly loathsome, a worse fate than the gallows awaited them. No one knows when the breaking wheel was first created, but the first references to
Oh, heck. Oh, yeah. Oh, bro. Huh? Bro, what?
the torture device can be found in literature from the 6th century.
Bro.
The condemned would be taken to a
Bro.
public stage and tied to the floor,
Bro.
at which point the giant spoked wheel would be rolled in. The goal of this first stage of the execution was to exact extreme pain, starting with breaking the legs of the convict by dropping the wheel on their shins. Sometimes this would be followed up.
Hey, quit playing with me, bro. Let me watch my video in peace.
You're not ready for it.
Can't watch my video in peace. They
By
keep on
killing
throwing
the
ads at
inmate
me.
by dropping the wheel on their neck. But this wasn't common, because the public demanded more blood than that. In most cases, the poor convict was lifted up once their limbs had been broken and bound to the wheel in agonizing pain. Their broken limbs often let the authorities snake their arms and legs through the holes. The breaking wheel was then raised on a pole, and the inmate was either left to die, beheaded, or lit on fire. The body was often left
Damn, my bad. I thought it was like that twisty shit.
up for display on the wheel as scavengers
looks
had their way,
different.
making this resemble crucifixion in many ways. However, there was always a way out. If the convict fell off the wheel while still alive or survived the execution, they were deemed to be spared by God. Their injuries were treated, they were typically pardoned of their crimes, and were in a rare position of being one of the only people to survive one of the worst punishments in human history. The worst punishment often lasted a long
I'll
time.
be up there praying to God every second, boy. Let me just fall, please. Let me just fall. Let them not have dead tighten up or something. You know what I'm saying? Something.
But few were as disturbing as this one. Number 9, impalement. How disturbing does a punishment have to be for the man who inspired Dracula to go, yeah, I like that, I'm going to make it my signature? Despite the association with the infamous Vlad Tepes, the Romanian leader didn't create the punishment of impalement.
Nah,
It
we ain't doing this. We ain't doing
used
this.
since ancient Mesopotamia as a way to punish particularly hated criminals. It was a simple method, but almost unspeakably brutal. A large sharpened stake is taken and inserted up the backside of the unfortunate convict and pushed forward until it emerges through the mouth, almost always causing fatal damage. They were supposed to serve as a message, as the stake was then raised and planted in the ground with the victim still attached to it. In the most brutal cases,
bro, before I let y'all do that, I'ma beat y'all ass. I'ma beat y'all ass, and if I can't beat all y'all ass, then y'all gonna have to kill me right there. Y'all ain't impaling me. Not alive. Not alive. Not alive.
fields of these victims
Not on duty.
were planted as a grim warning to anyone thinking of invading the territory. At least it'd be a swift death though, right? Maybe, maybe not. While poorly trained users would no doubt pierce the internal organs and lead to the person bleeding out in agonizing pain over a few hours, some more modern users figured out how to thread the stake effectively and follow the spine. This caused minimal damage and allowed the person to linger for days, with the record reportedly being 8 days. Wait, did you just say more modern users? Yep, this
Niggas sat there hanging for 8 days. What the fuck?
horrible tactic did not die with Vlad the Impaler. It was used extensively by the Ottoman Empire, most infamously during the Armenian genocide that began in 1915. There are also reports that it was used by the Dutch rulers of the East Indies during the colonial era. Vlad, no doubt, would be
They be glorifying these motherfuckers though.
proud. This next technique might be the most infamous execution method of the Middle Ages. Number 8, the rack. Most of the punishments on this list are execution methods that get a little too ambitious with prolonging death. But punishment isn't the only goal of torture. Sometimes the torturers need some information, and the old guard was willing to get a lot more brutal than slapping people with a phone book. Enter the rack, a simple device that looks like an old-fashioned washboard. But this device wasn't used to clean clothes. It was used to create pain. The wooden frame featured a roller at both ends.
hate that bitch, bro. Y'all don't even know what I'm talking about. I hate that bitch, bro.
Victims' hands were tied to the top end while their legs were attached to the bottom
Oh,
end.
fuck.
As the interrogation advanced, the torturers slowly rolled the rack, extending the victim's arms and legs until they could give no more, and it only gets worse from there. Unlike the other methods, the rack doesn't deliver immediate fatal injury. Rather, it deals out slow-level pain that gets worse and worse as the ligaments, cartilage, and bones of the arms and legs are stretched beyond what they can handle. This can quickly break a person down, as their shoulders and hips separate and their limbs are ruined. Even if one was able to escape the rack, it's unlikely they could walk after it did its work. This also kept the person immobile for future torture, such as using hot coals to burn them. The rack was so feared that sadistic interrogators would often use the rack on one person and force another to watch to try to break both of them down. The use of this device mostly died out in the 1600s, but it was reportedly revived in 18th century Russia. But it wasn't the most common method of torture in the Middle Ages. Number 7. Auto de fe. The Spanish Inquisition was one of the most infamous affairs of religious persecution in the world, as the particularly brutal authorities built on the Roman Catholic Church's enforcement of laws. Opposing religion was largely banned. Converts were surveilled and interrogated to...
Hey, why bro look like a pointy pumpkin? Or it's just me? He look like a pointy pumpkin with jack-o'-lantern with no light in that bitch.
Sure, they weren't keeping their old faiths, and anyone suspected of heresy was subjected to extreme torture under the authority of the infamous Takamata. And for those who confessed, an even worse fate awaited them. They would be subjected to a ritual.
Crazy thing about it, they did all this torturing and shit, and then went home, prayed that night, prayed to God, like God got your back. Boy, you going to hell? What you?
Of public penance, where they would be paraded before the public and abused, wearing garments bearing their accused crimes. Then the authorities would proclaim their guilt or innocence. For some, it would be innocence, as they would collapse in gratitude and relief. But for most, it would be guilty, and horrors awaited them. The punishment would typically begin with public whipping and torture, but it would only end one way. The convicted would be tied to a stake, kindling would be piled under them, and they would be lit afire and burned to death while still alive. It was a horrifying way to die, but the only grace of mercy was that many passed out from the intense smoke before they burned to death. This execution technique is typically associated with witch burnings, but most of those killed by burning over the centuries, from the 15th to the 19th, were either religious minorities or critics of the dogma and tactics of the Inquisition. And it stayed in Europe. Despite persistent rumors, no witches, accused or otherwise, were ever burned in Salem. Not all these punishments are famous, but this next one is no less disgusting. Number 6. Schwedentrunk. The Swedish drink. Sounds delicious. Maybe like a lingonberry soda. But for those who were being invaded by Swedish troops during the 30 Years' War in the 1600s, it was no laughing matter. This wasn't so much a traditional punishment as a method of...
That ain't hay, boy. That's cheese.
Torture and robbery used by ruthless soldiers, many of whom were out of supplies and intended to take them from the locals by any means necessary. It's a simple technique. Force your captives to drink as much as they possibly can, until they give you what you want. If you've ever tried to drink a whole gallon of water as a part of a dare, you know this can get very unpleasant, very quickly, because your stomach can only handle so much. But this wasn't just drinking water. The Swedish troops would tie the person up and use a funnel to pour the liquid into the person's mouth, and the actual substance would be an unpleasant surprise. Sometimes it would be water, sometimes it would be boiling water, causing terrible internal burns. Sometimes it would just be disgusting, like urine or sewage. In addition to the possible poisoning or infection, this could cause the person's stomach to stretch or burst from the massive amount of liquid.
Bro, this ad, they do another ad, bro. They do another ad, bro. And this bitch unskippable, bro.
If you give me just 89 seconds, I'm going to show you this $1 million skill that they were scared to teach you in school, and how you can use it to get
more than 5.
For the soldiers who wanted to add a little addition